12. When her visitors had taken their leave, Anna did not sit down, but began pacing up and down the room. Though she had involuntarily done all in her power to awaken love in Levin, as at that time she always did to all the young men she met, and though she knew she had succeeded in as far as was possible with an honourable married man in one evening, and though she had liked him very much, despite the marked difference between Vronsky and Levin from a man's point of view, she, as a woman, saw in them that common trait which had caused Kitty to fall in love with them both. Yet as soon as he had left the room, she ceased to think about him. One thought, and only one, pursued her remorselessly in different forms. If I produce such an effect on others, on this married man who loves his wife, why is he so cold toward me? And it is not coldness, for I know he loves me, but something fresh now divides us. Why has he been away all the evening? He sent word by Stiva that he could not leave Yashvin, but must keep an eye on his play. Is Yashvin such a child? But admitting that it's true, he never tells lies, then behind that truth there is something else. He's glad of a chance to show me that he has other obligations. I know he has, I agree to that, but why prove it to me? He wishes to give me proofs that his love of me must not interfere with his freedom. But I don't need proofs, I need love. He ought to understand the hardship of my life here in Moscow. Is it life? I do not live, but only wait for a solution which is deferred and still deferred. Again no answer. And Stiva says he can't go to see Alexis Alexandrovich, and I can't write again. I can't do anything, begin anything, change anything. I restrain myself, wait, invent occupations for myself. The English family, writing, reading. But all that is only deception. It is all a kind of morphia. He ought to pity me, said she, feeling tears of self-compassion rising to her eyes. She heard Vronsky's vehement ring at the front door, and quickly dried her eyes. She even sat down near the lamp and opened a book, pretending to be tranquil. She must let him see that she was displeased that he had not returned when he had promised. Displeased, that should be all. She would on no account show him her grief, and still less her self-compassion. She might pity herself, but he might not pity her. She did not want strife, and blamed him for wanting to fight, but yet she involuntarily took up a fighting attitude. "Well, you've not been dull?" he asked cheerfully and with animation, coming up to her. "What a terrible passion gambling is." "No, I've not been dull. I've long ago learned not to feel dull. Stiva and Levin were here." "Yes, I knew they were coming to see you. And how did you like Levin?" he asked, taking a seat beside her. "Very much. They only left a short while ago. What did Yashvin do?" "He was lucky and won 17,000. I called him away and very nearly got him to come. But he went back and now has lost more than he had won." "Then what was the good of your staying with him?" she said, suddenly raising her eyes to his face. Her look was cold and hostile. "You told Stiva you were staying to bring Yashvin away, but you've left him." A similar cold expression of readiness for strife appeared on his face. "For one thing, I did not give him any message for you, and for another, I never say what is not true. But chiefly, I wanted to stay, so I stayed," he replied with a frown. "Anna, why? Why?" he asked after a short pause, bending toward her and opening his hand, hoping that she would place hers in it. She was pleased by this appeal to tenderness, but some strange, evil power prevented her from yielding to her impulse, as if the conditions of the struggle did not allow her to submit. "Of course you wished to stay, and stayed. You always do what you wish. But why tell me? Why?" she said, becoming more and more agitated. "Does anyone dispute your right? But you want to be in the right, so in the right you must be." His hand closed, he leaned back, and his face assumed a still more stubborn look. "For you it's a matter of obstinacy," she said, after gazing intently at him and suddenly finding a name for that look that irritated her so. "Just obstinacy. For you it is a question whether you will conquer me, and for me—" Again she felt sorry for herself, and nearly burst into tears. "If you only knew what it means to me. When I feel as I do now, that you are hostile toward me. Hostile is the right word. If you only knew what that means to me. If you knew how near I am to catastrophe at such moments. How afraid I am. Afraid of myself." And she turned away to hide her sobs. "But what is it all about?" he said, horrified at her expression of despair, and again leaning toward her, he took her hand and kissed it. "What have I done? Do I seek amusement outside our home? Do I not avoid the society of women?" "I should hope so," she said. "Well then, tell me what I should do to make you easy. I'm ready to do anything to make you happy," he went on, touched by her despair. "What would I not do to spare you such a grief as this? About I know not what." "Anna!" "Nothing, nothing," she replied. "I don't know myself whether it is this lonely life or nerves. But don't let's talk about it. What about the races? You haven't told me about them." And she tried to hide her triumph at her victory, for the victory was hers after all. He asked for supper and began telling her about the races. But by his tone and by his looks, which grew colder and colder, she saw that he had not forgiven her her victory, and that the obstinacy against which she had fought had again taken possession of him. He was colder to her than before, as if he repented of having submitted. And remembering the words which had given her the victory, "I am near a catastrophe and afraid of myself," she realized that they were a dangerous weapon, and must not be used a second time. She felt that side by side with the love that united them, there had grown up some evil spirit of strife, which she could not cast out of his heart, and still less out of her own. 13. There are no conditions of life to which a man cannot accustom himself, especially if he sees that everyone around him lives in the same way. 3 months previously, Levin would not have believed that he could quietly fall asleep under the circumstances in which he now found himself. That while leading an aimless, senseless life, one moreover that was above his means, after tippling, he could call what had happened in the club by no other name, after showing unsuitable friendship to the man with whom his wife had once been in love, and after a still more unsuitable visit to a woman who could only be called a fallen woman, and after being allured by her and having grieved his wife, that in such circumstances he could quietly fall asleep. But under the influence of weariness, a sleepless night, and the wine he had drunk, he slept soundly and peacefully. At 5 in the morning the creak of an opening door awoke him. He jumped up and looked round. Kitty was not on the bed beside him, but on the other side of the partition a light was moving, and he heard her step. "What is it? What is it?" he muttered, not yet quite awake. "Kitty, what is it?" "Nothing," said she, coming candle in hand from beyond the partition. "I only felt a little unwell," she added, with a peculiarly sweet and significant smile. "What? Has he begun? Has it?" he asked in a frightened voice. "We must send—" and he began to dress hurriedly. "No, no," she said, smiling, holding him back with her hand. "I'm sure it's nothing. I only felt slightly unwell. But it's over now." She came back to her bed, put out the candle, lay down, and remained quiet. Though that quietness, as if she were holding her breath, and especially the peculiar tenderness and animation with which, returning from the other side of the partition, she had said, "It's nothing," seemed to him suspicious, yet he was so sleepy that he fell asleep at once. Only afterwards he remembered that bated breath, and realized all that had passed in her dear sweet soul, while she lay motionless by his side, awaiting the greatest event of a woman's life. At 7 o'clock he was awakened by her touch on his shoulder and a soft whisper. She seemed to hesitate between regret at waking him and a desire to speak to him. "Kostya, don't be frightened. It's nothing, but I think we must send for Mary Vlasievna." The candle was burning again. She was sitting on the bed, holding in her hand some knitting she had lately been doing. "Please don't be frightened. It's nothing. I'm not a bit afraid," she said, on seeing his alarmed face, and she pressed his hand to her breast and then to her lips. He jumped up hastily, hardly aware of himself, and without taking his eyes off her, put on his dressing gown and stood still, gazing at her. It was necessary for him to go, but he could not tear himself away from the sight of her. He had loved that face and known all its expressions and looks, but he had never seen her as she was now. How vile and despicable he appeared to himself before her as she now was, when he recollected the grief he had caused her yesterday. Her flushed face, surrounded with soft hair that had escaped from beneath her nightcap, shone with joy and resolution. Little as there was of affectation and conventionality in Kitty's general character, yet Levin was astonished at what was revealed to him now that every veil had fallen and the very kernel of her soul shone through her eyes. And in this simplicity, this nakedness of soul, she whom he loved was more apparent than ever. She looked at him smilingly, but suddenly her eyebrows twitched. She raised her head, and coming quickly to him, she took hold of his hand, and clinging close, she enveloped him in her hot breath. She was suffering, and seemed to be complaining to him of her pain. And for a moment, from force of habit, he felt as if he were in fault. But her look expressed a tenderness which told him that she not only did not blame him, but loved him because of those sufferings. "If I am not to blame for it, who is?" he thought, involuntarily seeking a culprit to punish for these sufferings. But there was no culprit. She suffered, complained, triumphed in her sufferings, rejoiced in them, and loved them. He saw that something beautiful was taking place in her soul, but what it was he could not understand. It was above his comprehension. "I have sent for Mamma. And you, go quickly and fetch Marya Vlasyevna." "Kostya." "No, it's nothing. It's past." She moved away from him and rang. "Well, go now. Pasha is coming. I'm all right." And Levin saw with amazement that she again took up the knitting which she had fetched in the night, and recommenced work. As Levin went out at one door, he heard the maid enter at the other. He stopped at the door and heard Kitty give detailed instructions to the maid, and with her help, herself move the bed. He dressed, and while the horse was being harnessed, for it was early and no izvozchiks were about yet, he ran back to the bedroom, not on tiptoe, but, as it seemed to him, on wings. Two maids were busy moving something in the bedroom. Kitty was walking up and down and knitting, rapidly throwing the thread over the needle and giving orders. "I'm going straight to the doctor's. They've already gone for Marya Vlasyevna, but I will call there too. Is anything else wanted?" "Ah, yes, to Dolly." She looked at him, evidently not listening to what he was saying. Yes, go," she said rapidly, frowning and motioning him away with her hand. He was already on his way through the drawing-room, when suddenly a piteous moan, that lasted only a moment, reached him from the bedroom. He stopped, and for a moment could not understand it. "Yes, it was she," he said, and, clasping his head with his hands, he ran downstairs. "Lord have mercy, pardon and help us." He repeated the words that suddenly and unexpectedly sprang to his lips. And he, an unbeliever, repeated those words not with his lips only. At that instant he knew that neither his doubts nor the impossibility of believing with his reason, of which he was conscious, at all prevented his appealing to God. It all flew off like dust. To whom should he appeal, if not to him in whose hands he felt himself, his soul, and his love to be? The horse was not yet ready, but feeling particularly energetic, physically strong and alert to meet what lay before him, so as not to lose a moment, he did not wait for it, but started off on foot, telling Kuzma to catch him up. At the corner he encountered a night izvozchik hurrying along. In the little sledge sat Marya Vlasyevna in a velvet cloak, with a shawl over her head. "Thank God," he muttered, recognizing with delight her little blonde face, which now wore a particularly serious and even severe expression. Without stopping the izvozchik, he ran back beside her. "So it began about 2 hours ago, not more?" she asked. "You will find the doctor, but don't hurry him. And get some opium at the chemist's." "So you think it may go all right?" "God have mercy and help us," said Levin as he saw his horse coming out of the gateway. Jumping into the sledge beside Kuzma, he ordered him to drive to the doctor's. 14. The doctor was not yet up, and his footman said he had gone to bed late and given orders that he was not to be called, but the footman added that he would be up soon. The man was cleaning lamp glasses and seemed quite absorbed in his task. This attention to his glasses and indifference to what was taking place at the Levinses astonished Levin at first, but he immediately recollected himself and realized that no one knew or was bound to know his feelings, and that it was therefore all the more necessary to act calmly, deliberately, and firmly in order to break through this wall of indifference and to attain his aim. "Do not hurry and do not omit anything," he said to himself, conscious of an increasing uplift of his physical powers and of his attention to all that lay before him. Having learned that the doctor was not up yet, Levin, out of the many plans that occurred to him, decided on the following. Kuzma should go with a note to another doctor, while he himself would go to the chemist for the opium. And if the doctor was not up when he returned, he would bribe the footman, or if that was impossible, he would enter by force and wake the doctor at all costs. At the chemist's, a skinny dispenser, with the same indifference with which the footman had cleaned his lamp glasses, closed with a wafer a packet of powders for which a coachman was waiting, and refused to let Levin have any opium. Trying not to hurry and not to get excited, Levin gave the names of the doctor and of the midwife, explained why the opium was wanted, and tried to persuade the dispenser to let him have it. The dispenser asked in German whether he might sell it, and receiving permission from someone behind a screen, took out a bottle and a funnel, slowly poured it from a large bottle into a small one, stuck on a label, and, in spite of Levin's request that he should not do so, sealed up the bottle and was about to wrap it up. This was more than Levin could stand. He resolutely snatched the bottle out from the man's hands and rushed out at the big glass door. The doctor was not up yet, and the footman, now busy putting down a carpet, refused to wake him. Levin deliberately took out a 10-ruble note, and speaking slowly but without losing time, handed him the note and explained that Dr. Peter Dmitrich, how great and important this Peter Dmitrich, formerly so insignificant, now appeared to Levin, had promised to come at any time, and that he would certainly not be angry and must therefore be called at once. The footman consented and went upstairs, asking Levin to step into the waiting room. Levin could hear the doctor at the other side of the door coughing, walking about, washing and speaking. Some 3 minutes elapsed. To Levin, they seemed more than an hour. He could not wait any longer. "Peter Dmitrich! Peter Dmitrich!" he called out in a tone of entreaty through the open door. "For heaven's sake, forgive me. Receive me as you are. It's over 2 hours. Immediately, answered a voice, and Levin was astounded to detect that the doctor was smiling as he said it. "Just for 1 moment." "Immediately." 2 minutes more passed while the doctor put on his boots, and 2 more while he put on his clothes and brushed his hair. "Peter Dmitrich," Levin again began in a piteous voice, but at that instant the doctor came out, dressed and with his hair brushed. "These people have no conscience," thought Levin, "brushing their hair while we are perishing." "Good morning," said the doctor, holding out his hand and, as it seemed to Levin, teasing him by his calm manner. "Don't hurry. Well?" Trying to be as exact as possible, Levin began recounting every unnecessary detail of his wife's position, continually interrupting himself to beg the doctor to accompany him at once. "Don't be in such a hurry. You see you are inexperienced. I'm sure I shall not be needed, but I promised, and if you like I will come. But there is no hurry. Please sit down. Won't you have a cup of coffee?" Levin gave the doctor a look, which asked whether he was not laughing at him. But the doctor had no idea of laughing. I know, he said with a smile. I'm a family man myself. We husbands are the most miserable of creatures at those times. I have a patient whose husband always runs away into the stable on such occasions. But what is your opinion, Peter Dmitrich? Do you think it may go all right? All the symptoms are favourable. Then you will come at once? Said Levin, looking angrily at the servant who brought in the coffee. In an hour's time. No, for heaven's sake. Well, only let me finish my coffee. The doctor began on his coffee. Both kept silence. Well, the Turks are being seriously beaten. Did you read yesterday's telegram? Asked the doctor, chewing a piece of roll. No, I can't stand it, said Levin, jumping up. So you will come in a quarter of an hour? In half an hour. On your honour? Levin got home just as the princess arrived, and they met at the bedroom door. There were tears in the princess's eyes, and her hands shook. When she saw Levin, she embraced him and began to cry. Well, Mary Vlazevna, darling? She asked, seizing the hand of the midwife, who came toward them with a beaming but preoccupied expression. It's going all right, she said. Persuade her to lie down. It will be easier for her. From the moment when he woke up and understood what was the matter, Levin had braced himself to endure what might await him, without reasoning and without anticipating anything, firmly suppressing all his thoughts and feelings, determined not to upset his wife, but on the contrary, to calm and support her. Not allowing himself even to think of what was about to happen and how it would end, judging by inquiries he had made as to the time such affairs usually lasted, Levin mentally prepared himself to endure and to keep his heart under restraint for something like 5 hours, which seemed to him within his power. But when he returned from the doctor's and again saw her sufferings, he began repeating more and more often, God, pardon and help us, sighing and lifting his head, afraid lest he should not be able to bear the strain and should either burst into tears or run away, so tormenting was it for him. And only 1 hour had passed. But after that hour, another passed, a second, a third, and all the 5 hours that he had set himself as the longest term of possible endurance, and still the situation was unchanged. And he went on enduring, for there was nothing else to do but to endure, thinking every moment that he had reached the utmost limit of endurance, and that in a moment his heart would burst with pity. But the minutes went by, and the hours, and other hours, and his suffering and terror and strain grew tenser. The ordinary conditions of life, without which nothing can be imagined, no longer existed for Levin. He lost a sense of time. Sometimes minutes, those minutes when she called him to her and he held her moist hand, now pressing his with extraordinary strength and now pushing him away, seemed to him like hours. And then again hours seemed but minutes. He was surprised when Mary Vlazevna asked him to light a candle behind the partition, and he learned that it was already 5 o'clock in the evening. Had he been told it was 10 in the morning, he would not have been more astonished. He had just as little idea of where he was at that time as he had of when it all took place. He saw her burning face, now bewildered and full of suffering, and now smiling and soothing him. He saw the princess red, overwrought, her grey hair out of curl, and with tears which she energetically swallowed, biting her lips. He saw Dolly. He saw the doctor smoking thick cigarettes, and Mary Vlazevna with a firm, resolute and tranquilizing look on her face, and the old prince pacing up and down the ballroom and frowning. But he did not know how they came and went, nor where they were. The princess was one moment in the bedroom with the doctor, and the next in the study, where a table laid for a meal had made its appearance. And next it was not the princess, but Dolly. Afterwards, Levin remembered being sent somewhere. Once he was told to fetch a table and a sofa. He did it with zeal, believing that it was necessary for her sake, and only later discovered that he had been preparing a sleeping place for himself. Then he was sent to the study to ask the doctor about something. The doctor answered him, and then began talking about the scenes in the city Duma. Then he was sent to fetch an icon with silver gilt mounts from the princess's bedroom, and he and the princess's old lady's maid climbed on a cupboard to get down the icon, and he broke the little lamp that burned before it, and the old servant tried to comfort him about his wife and about the lamp. He brought the icon back with him and put it at the head of Kitty's bed, carefully pushing it in behind the pillows. But where, when, and why all this was done, he did not know. Nor did he understand why the princess took his hand, and looking pitifully at him, entreated him to be calm. Nor why Dolly tried to persuade him to eat something and let him out of the room. Nor why even the doctor looked seriously and sympathizingly at him, offering him some drops. He only knew and felt that what was happening was similar to what had happened the year before in the hotel of the provincial town on the deathbed of his brother Nicholas. Only that was sorrow, and this was joy. But that sorrow and this joy were equally beyond the usual conditions of life. They were like openings in that usual life through which something higher became visible. And, as in that case, what was now being accomplished came harshly, painfully, incomprehensibly. And while watching it, the soul soared, as then, to heights it had never known before, at which reason could not keep up with it. "Lord, pardon and help us," he kept repeating incessantly to himself, appealing to God, in spite of a long period of apparently complete estrangement, just as trustingly and simply as in the days of childhood and early youth. During the whole of that time, he was alternately in two different moods. One mood when not in her presence, when with the doctor, who smoked one thick cigarette after another and extinguished them against the rim of the overflowing ashpan. One with Dolly and the prince, where they talked about dinner, politics, or Mary Petrovna's illness. And when Levin suddenly quite forgot for an instant what was happening, and felt just as if he was waking up. And the other was in her presence, by her pillow, where his heart was ready to burst with pity, and yet did not burst. And there he prayed unceasingly to God. And every time when the screams that came from the bedroom roused him from momentary forgetfulness, he succumbed to the same strange error that had possessed him in the first moments. Every time, on hearing the scream, he jumped up and ran to justify himself, but recollected on the way that he was not to blame, and that he longed to protect and help her. But when, looking at her, he again saw that to help was impossible, he was seized with horror and said, "Lord, pardon and help us." And the longer it lasted, the stronger grew both his moods. Out of her presence he became calmer, quite forgetting her, and at the same time both her sufferings and his feeling of the impossibility of helping her became more and more poignant. He would jump up, wishing to run away somewhere, but ran to her instead. Sometimes when she had called him again and again, he was half inclined to blame her. But seeing her meek, smiling face and hearing her say, "I've worn you out," he blamed God. But the thought of God made him at once pray for forgiveness and mercy. 15. He did not know whether it was late or early. The candles were all burning low. Dolly had just entered the study and suggested that the doctor should lie down. Levin sat listening to the doctor's stories of a quack magnetizer and staring at the ash of the doctor's cigarette. It was an interval of rest and oblivion. He had quite forgotten what was going on. He listened to the doctor's tale and understood it. Suddenly there was a scream unlike anything he had ever heard. The scream was so terrible that Levin did not even jump up, but looked breathlessly with a frightened and inquiring glance at the doctor, who bent his head on one side to listen and smiled approvingly. Everything was so out of the ordinary that nothing any longer surprised Levin. Probably it had to be so, thought he, and remained sitting still. But who was it screaming? He jumped up and rushed into the bedroom on tiptoe, past Mary Vlazevna and the princess, and stopped at his place at the head of the bed. The screaming had ceased, but there was a change. What it was he could not make out or understand, nor did he want to understand it, but he read it in Mary Vlazevna's face. She looked pale and stern, and as resolute as before, though her jaw trembled a little, and her eyes were fixed intently on Kitty. Kitty's burning face, worn with suffering, with a lock of hair clinging to her clammy forehead, was turned toward him, trying to catch his eye. Her raised hands asked for his. Seizing his cold hands in her perspiring ones, she pressed them to her face. "Don't go, don't go. I'm not afraid, she said rapidly. "Mamma, take off my earrings, they're in the way." "You're not afraid?" "Soon, Marya Vlasevna, soon." She spoke very rapidly and tried to smile, but all at once her face became distorted, and she pushed him away. "No, this is awful. I shall die. Die. Go, go," she cried, and again he heard that scream unlike any other cry. Levin clasped his head in his hands and ran out of the room. It's all right, all goes well," Dolly called after him. But say what they might, he knew that now all was lost. Leaning his head against the doorpost, he stood in the next room, and heard someone shrieking and moaning in a way he had never heard till then. And he knew that these sounds were produced by what once was Kitty. He had long ceased wishing for a child, and now he hated that child. He did not now even wish her to live, but only longed that these terrible sufferings should end. "Doctor, what is it? What is it?" "Oh, my God," he cried, grasping the hand of the doctor who had just entered. "It's coming to an end," said the doctor, with a face so serious that Levin thought that end meant death. Quite beside himself, he rushed into a room. The first thing he saw was Marya Vlasevna's face. It was still more frowning and stern. Kitty's face did not exist. In its place was something terrible, both because of its strained expression and because of the sounds which proceeded from it. He let his head drop upon the wood of the bedstead, feeling that his heart was breaking. The terrible screaming did not cease, but grew yet more awful, until, as if it had reached the utmost limit of horror, it suddenly ceased. Levin could scarcely believe his ears, but there was no room for doubt. The screaming had ceased, and he heard a sound of movement, of rustling, of accelerated breathing, and her voice, faltering, living, tender, and happy, as it said, "It's over." He raised his head. With her arm helplessly outstretched upon the quilt, unusually beautiful and calm, she lay, gazing silently at him, trying unsuccessfully to smile. And suddenly, out of the mysterious, terrible, and unearthly world in which he had been living for the last 22 hours, Levin felt himself instantaneously transported back to the old everyday world, but now radiant with the light of such new joy that it was unsupportable. The taut strings snapped, and sobs and tears of joy that he had not in the least anticipated arose within him, with such force that they shook his whole body and long prevented his speaking. Falling on his knees by her bedside, he held his wife's hands to his lips. Kissing it, and that hand, by a feeble movement of the fingers, replied to the kisses. And meanwhile at the foot of the bed, like a flame above a lamp, flickered in Marya Vlasevna's skilful hands the life of a human being who had never before existed. A human being who, with the same right and the same importance to himself, would live and would procreate others like himself. "Alive, alive, and a boy! Don't be anxious," Levin heard Marya Vlasevna say, as she slapped the baby's back with a shaking hand. "Mamma, is it true?" asked Kitty. The princess could only sob in reply. And amid the silence, as a positive answer to the mother's question, a voice quite unlike all the restrained voices that had been speaking in the room made itself heard. It was a bold, insolent voice that had no consideration for anything. It was the cry of the new human being who had so incomprehensibly appeared from some unknown realm. Before that, if Levin had been told that Kitty was dead, and that he had died with her, that they had angel children, and that God was there present with him, he would not have been astonished. But now, having returned to the world of actuality, he had to make great efforts to understand that she was alive and well, and that the creature that was yelling so desperately was his son. Kitty was alive, her sufferings were over, and he was full of unspeakable bliss. This he comprehended, and it rendered him entirely happy. But the child, whence and why had he come? Who was he? He could not at all accustom himself to the idea. It seemed something superfluous, something overflowing, and for a long time he was unable to get used to it. "16. Toward 10 o'clock, the old prince, Kosnichev, and Oblonsky were with Levin, and having talked about the young mother, they had begun discussing other matters. Levin listened to them, and at the same time involuntarily thought of the past and of what had been going on before that morning, remembering himself as he had been yesterday before this event. 100 years seemed to have elapsed since then. He felt as if he were on some unattainable height, from which he painstakingly descended in order not to hurt the feelings of those with whom he was conversing. He talked, but never ceased thinking of his wife, of the details of her present condition, and of his son, to the ideas of whose existence he painstakingly tried to accustom himself. That feminine world, which since his marriage had received a new and unsuspected significance for him, now rose so high in his estimation that his imagination could not grasp it. He heard a conversation about yesterday's dinner at the club and thought, "What is happening to her now? Is she asleep? How is she? What is she thinking about? Is our son, Dmitri, crying?" And in the middle of the conversation, in the middle of a phrase, he suddenly jumped up and left the room. "Send and let me know whether I may see her," said the old prince. "All right, directly," answered Levin, and without pausing, went to her room. She was not asleep, but was talking quietly with her mother, making plans for the christening. Made neat, her hair brushed, a smart cap trimmed with something blue on her head, she lay on her back with her arms outside the quilt, and met his look with a look which drew him toward her. That look, already bright, grew still brighter as he approached. On her face was the same change from the earthly to that which was beyond earth, as is seen on the faces of the dead. But in their case it is a farewell, in hers it was a welcome. Again an agitation, similar to that which he had felt at the moment of the birth, gripped his heart. She took his hand and asked whether he had slept. He could not answer and, conscious of his weakness, turned away. "And I've been dozing, Kostya," she said, "and now I feel so comfortable." She was gazing at him, but suddenly her face changed. "Let me have him," said she, hearing the baby's cry. "Let me have him, Marya Vlasevna, and he will see him too." "Well then, we'll let Papa have a look," said Marya Vlasevna, lifting something red, strange and quivering, and bringing it nearer. "But wait a bit, let's first get dressed," and Marya Vlasevna put the quivering red object on the bed, and began unwrapping it, and then swallowing it again, raising and turning it with one finger, and powdering it with something. Levin, gazing at this tiny, piteous being, vainly searched his soul for some indications of paternal feeling. He felt nothing for it but repulsion. But when it was stripped, and he caught a glimpse of thin little arms, and legs saffron-coloured, but with fingers and toes and even with thumbs distinguishable from the rest, and when he saw how, as though they were soft springs, Marya Vlasevna bent those little arms which stuck up, and encased them in linen garments, he was so filled with pity for that being, and so alarmed lest she should hurt it, that he tried to restrain her hand. Marya Vlasevna laughed. "Don't be afraid, don't be afraid." When the baby had been swaddled and made into a firm doll, Marya Vlasevna turned it over as if proud of her work, and stepped aside that Levin might see his son in all his beauty. Kitty turned her eyes and gazed fixedly in the same direction. "Let me have him, let me have him," she said, and was even going to raise herself. "What are you doing, Catherine Alexandrovna? You must not move like that. Wait a moment, I'll give him to you. Let's show Papa what a fine fellow we are." And Marya Vlasevna held out to Levin on one hand, the other merely supporting the nape of the shaky head, this strange, limp, red creature, that hid its head in its swaddling clothes, but there was also a nose, blinking eyes, and smacking lips. "A beautiful baby," said Marya Vlazevna. Levin sighed bitterly. This beautiful baby only inspired him with a sense of repulsion and pity. These were not at all the feelings he had expected. He turned away while Marya Vlazevna laid the child to the unaccustomed breast. Suddenly a laugh made him lift his head. It was Kitty laughing. The baby had taken the breast. "Well, that's enough, said Marya Vlazevna. But Kitty would not part with the baby. He fell asleep in her arms. "Now look at him," said Kitty, turning him so that Levin could see him. The odd-looking little face wrinkled up still more, and the baby sneezed. Smiling, and hardly able to keep back tears of tenderness, Levin kissed his wife and quitted the darkened room. What he felt toward this little creature was not at all what he had anticipated. There was nothing merry or joyful in it. On the contrary, there was a new and distressing sense of fear. It was the consciousness of another vulnerable region. And this consciousness was at first so painful, the fear lest that helpless being should suffer was so strong, that it quite hid the strange feeling of unreasoning joy, and even pride, which he experienced when the baby sneezed.